Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all here. I'm Martin Jean. I direct the ISM. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Now, my colleagues don't really know this, but for nearly 20 years, I've wanted to say the following words: welcome Ed Foley to the Kavanagh Lecture. So, Ed, whether he knows it or not, I've been devoted to his work for many, many years, and we go back to my Midwestern days, and we have connections to my old university, Valparaiso, and he's just one of those scholars in your life where you just kind of resonate thoughts and so on. I think you'll see why in a minute. So as you know, this lectureship is named after Aidan Kavanagh. Father Aidan Kavanagh was a monk and priest of St. Meinrad's Arch Abbey in Indiana, and joined the faculty here at Yale in 1994, having come from the University of Notre Dame. In both places, he taught liturgical studies and, of course, was one of the premier liturgical theologians and historians of the 20th century. A major, major influence to many, many people. In addition to his work as faculty, he had a short sentence as interim dean of YDS and interim director of the ISM as well. And this lectureship, which was started by my predecessor, Margot Fassler, maybe nearly 20 years ago, has brought any number of luminaries to our campus, including John Baldwin, who was our inaugural lecturer, Maxwell Johnson, Gabriella Winkler, Catherine Vinci, Lizette Larson-Miller, Gordon Lathrop, Larry Hoffman, many, many other names, all of whom I'm sure you know in one capacity or another. But for you to get to know a little bit more about Ed Foley, I'll turn to Teresa Berger.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Berger. I teach liturgical studies here at the Institute and at the Divinity School, and I coordinate the program in liturgical studies here. It's a great privilege and also a deep joy to introduce the Kavanagh Lecturer for this year, Father Edward Foley. He's the Duns Scotus Professor of Spirituality and Professor of Liturgy and Music at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, Illinois. Ed is a very ISM-y scholar, as we say here at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music. He holds both an MDiv and an MM in choral conducting, as well as an MA in liturgy and a PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame. Professor Foley is a prolific and award-winning author. His books have been translated into 9 languages, maybe by now 10. Among his many publications are, and I'll just lift out 3, Worship Music, a Concise Dictionary, which came out in 2000. Then the well-known, I have it here, I want you to sign my copy, From Age to Age, How Christians Have Celebrated the Eucharist. It's a fabulous book, not only from the scholarly side, but also if you love pictures and are a visual person, here is a Christmas present idea for you. The book was expanded and revised in 2008, published by Liturgical Press. And then most relevant for the topic of this year's Kavanagh Lecture, Ed was the general editor of a handbook for Catholic preaching, published also by Liturgical Press last year. In addition to the books, Father Foley has authored numerous chapters in books and articles in collections such as the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and then in journals that span across linguistic barriers and disciplinary boundaries. He's a past president of the North American Academy of Liturgy and a founder of the Catholic Academy of Liturgy. Last not least, he is an ordained priest who preaches and presides at Old St. Patrick's Church in Chicago And he's a gifted preacher himself. A recent sermon of his, which was preached on the Sunday following the Las Vegas massacre, is available online on the liturgy blog Pray Tell. It's a privilege indeed to have Ed with us to offer the 2017 Kavanagh Lecture. He will speak on this. Please join me in welcoming Father Edward Foley.
Thank you, Teresa. After an unusually florid introduction, then President Lyndon Johnson said, "I'm sorry that my parents were not here to hear it, because my father would have appreciated it and my mother would have believed it." We'll see what happens here. In his popular study on the universe entitled The Whole Shebang, writer Timothy Ferris laments what he calls the sadness of maps. This sadness for Ferris arises from the fact that despite the best intentions of those who craft them, all maps are imperfect in at least two ways. First, since maps represent the territory under investigation more economically than does the territory itself, they inevitably contain less information. Thus, they are more exclusive than inclusive. And second, maps introduce distortion, as they are two-dimensional guides to three-dimensional realities. There is a similar sadness around titles. The sadness of titles, whether that be for course offerings, movies, or university lectures, while they're intended to elicit interest or at least provoke a little curiosity, like maps, they are necessarily exclusive and introduce distortion. Thus, the title of this presentation is both a pastoral provocation and at least a distorted, if not inaccurate, caricature of both the current age and the nature of preaching. For example, one could characterize the current age from the perspective of dominant U.S. culture as a time of religious disaffiliation. This caricature is also inaccurate. While many in my own church are metaphorically leaving the group, or leaving home, the group we are bleeding the most, as is true of most other religious institutions in this country, is 18 to 35-year-olds. However, many of them are not actually leaving their spiritual homes or religiously disaffiliating. As Kate DeVries, the former director of the Young Adult Ministry Office in the Archdiocese of Chicago, pointedly noted in a response to an archdiocesan initiative entitled Catholics Come Home, she said, "You cannot invite young adults home to a church which for many was never really their home in the first place." Young adults, she opined, are not leaving home. Rather, many of them are simply abandoning the religious affiliation of their parents that many presumed would be their home, but never was. Thus, disaffiliation is merely one aspect of this era of spiritual fluidity that renders preaching within a faith tradition at least challenging, if not daunting. Maybe the topic is better served if we migrate from the binary of affiliation and disaffiliation to the more ambiguous frame of liquidity. In a celebrated 2000 publication, the Polish philosopher, sociologist Zygmunt Bauman christened the current era one of liquid modernity. While previous historical periods have witnessed cycles of sometimes radical disintegration and renewal, Bauman argues that current modernity is different. Whereas the solids of a previous era, such as the monarchy in Europe at the end of the 19th or the early 20th century, were deconstructed but then replaced by new solids, like communism in Russia, in this modernity, according to Bauman, melting solids are not being displaced with new and improved ones. Rather, the state of commerce, relationship, society, and even identity itself are characterized by liquidity, deregulation, liberalization, and what Bauman calls flexibilization, constantly poised for change. I guess you are allowed to create your own language when you write that much. The Christian churches have recently experienced waves of such liquidity in multiple and shocking waves. One such tsunami that hit the Roman Catholic Church was the 20th century, or 2007 religious landscape study from the Pew Forum on Religion and the Public Life, which noted that roughly 1 in 10 adults in the U.S. were former Roman Catholics. The Christian churches have recently experienced waves of liquidity in multiple and shocking ways. One such tsunami that hit the Roman Catholic Church was the 2007 religious landscape study from the Pew Forum on Religion and the Public Life, which, as I said, noted that roughly 1 in 10 adults in the U.S. were former Roman Catholics. If you gathered all of them together, they would become the 3rd largest denomination in the U.S. A parallel tidal wave hit virtually all other religions in the U.S. in 2007, which is the recognition that almost 15% of all adults in the U.S. at that time had no religious affiliation, a number that's grown so quickly that in 2014, Pew reported that the number of Americans who do not identify with any religion continues to grow at a rapid pace. 1/5 of the U.S. public and 1/3 of all adults under 30 years of age are religiously unaffiliated today. When they do their projections to 2050, they demonstrate that the only group apart from Muslims that will grow in terms of religious identification in the world are the non-affiliated. An even more telling sign of religious liquidity is the degree of disaffiliation occurring among those who nevertheless still identify with some religious body and even frequent our sanctuaries with some regularity. Already in 1985, sociologist Andrew Greeley documented this widespread phenomenon he called cafeteria Catholicism. According to Greeley, cafeteria Catholics are those who pick and choose among the teachings and practices of the church which they wish to hold or observe. A start example is one of the last things he published before he died in 2010, a report that demonstrated that only 7% of Roman Catholics in Chicago at the time accepted what Greeley called the 5 big rules: church stance against abortion, birth control, divorce, against gay marriage, and for infallibility. 7%. One frame for considering this phenomenon in my own tradition, and maybe yours, is what is alternately labeled secular or cultural Catholicism. If you know the work of Professor Tom Bedoin of New York's Fordham University, he actually believes that the majority of U.S. Catholics today could be characterized as secular or cultural Catholics, actually a term that's been borrowed from the phenomenon in 20th century Judaism in the United States. By these terms, Bedoin refers to those with a Catholic heritage, however nominal, who cannot find Catholicism central to the everyday project of their lives and are in varying degrees of distanciation from what they take to be normative or prescribed Catholicism. Secular Catholics are typically baptized Catholics who, by the time of adulthood, find themselves having to deal somehow with their Catholicism and to do so as an irremediable aspect of their identity, though in pastoral ministry they're called fallen away, lapsed, bad Catholics, nominal, or non-practicing. Secular Catholics find their Catholicity existentially in play at some level that cannot be dispensed with, but according to Bedoin, do not or cannot make of it a regular and central set of explicit and conscious practices. A pointed example of such cultural Catholicism appeared at the Chicago Tribune a couple of years ago when Illinois appellate judge Sheila O'Brien wrote, quote, "Would someone in Rome formally excommunicate me, please? I want to be excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church because walking away will break my heart." A similar sentiment was expressed by Kate Henley Averett at the time she was a PhD student in sociology at the University of Texas in Austin. She wrote, "I'm sure I believed that I could remain a Catholic despite the institutional church, but this place has become too foreign for me, and I can no longer call it home. And I'm so sad about that. My heart is so heavy, it feels like it's crushing me." If you know the work of the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, celebrated for his writings about the emergence of what he deemed a risk society, he has argued that one of the more challenging frameworks operative in such a society is what he calls zombie concepts. Zombies are the living dead, and a zombie concept is a social concept that is increasingly impotent or dead. He uses the example of social class, family, and I would contend the United States. It's a concept that's impotent. He says the zombie concepts are concepts that scholars keep alive to describe the growing fiction of traditional social institutions. While such zombie concepts have lost their explanatory power, according to Beck, they are still powerful in that they legitimize practices, actions, and explanations. So a fundamental question: are the very ideas of liturgical preaching, as well as the worship that provide its context, developing into zombie concepts that are increasingly impotent in their impact, except for maybe legitimizing the roles of preachers and pastors? Zombie categories emerged in the framework of Beck's larger work on reflexive modernization, that among other things calls into question the production and reproduction of knowledge between the laity and so-called experts. Beck argues that in many cases, lay people were probably much more knowledgeable or aware about what was going on around them than the so-called experts. This position has resonance with a field in practical theology called action research that recognizes people as active builders of meaning, that ordinary people have epistemological agency. It does not, it separates or refuses to separate the knower from the known. From my perspective, the implication of Beck's work for religious institutions and key practices like preaching are critical. In this epoch of liquid society and liquid faith, he challenges us not to allow churches or mosques or synagogues to become zombie institutions whose central energies are primarily expended to legitimize religious practices, beliefs, or power structures. He also prods us to theologize from the bottom up, from the grassroots, recognizing the agency and expertise of what he calls lay people, rather than instinctively relying on the so-called experts, present company included. Here's the Beckian rub. If those who attend the preaching event are increasingly liquid in their faith, cafeterial in their creed, secular in their belief, and polydoxical in their spirituality, how do we honor their embodied intelligence about faith or God or worship? How do we respect them as subjects of religious knowing without turning potential zombie faith in communities into communities of free believing or self-constructed religion, whose advent was already announced by what Robert Bella and Richard Madsen in their Habits of the Heart called Sheilaism? If you remember that, their informant, Sheila, reported, "I believe in God. I'm not a religious fanatic. I can't remember the last time I went to church. My faith has carried me a long way. It's Sheilaism, just my own little voice. It's just trying to love yourself and be gentle with yourself, take care of yourself. I think he would want us to take care of each other." Is that our future? Some contemporary thinkers do not believe that religion can make much of a contribution in this liquid era, but Beck believes otherwise, saying that religion can be a useful tool in what he considers the contemporary project of realistic cosmopolitanism. While acknowledging the destructive capacity of religiosity, like inspired violence, both past and present, Beck says it's hardly possible to overstate the potential of religions as cosmopolitan actors, not only because of their ability to mobilize billions of human beings across barriers of nation and class, but because they exercise a powerful influence on the way people see themselves and their relationship to the world. Above all, they represent a source of legitimation in a battle for the dignity of human beings in a civilization at risk of destroying itself. Beck continues, what is on the agenda is the competence and readiness of world religions to assume the role of spokespeople and champions on issues affecting humankind: climate change, the plight of the poor and excluded, and the dignity of ethnic, national, and religious others, something that some people have been recently tweeting a lot about. Maybe Beck has given us a credible path forward for rethinking worship and the preaching that punctuates it in this ambiguous, paradoxical age. Maybe the call is no more preaching from the inside out, but attending to these people, these poor and excluded and subaltern, not idealizing our religious communities as a light to the nations or mission sending, whose trajectory usually only moves from organ or altar or bema or prayer rug to the world. Maybe this is a pivotal moment to re-envision preaching as a Johannine event in service to a world where God already broods, embracing a new Rahner's contention that the liturgy of the world, not the liturgy of the church or mosque or synagogue, is primary. This liturgically recalibrates preaching. It transmutes into public theology, responding to a world threatened with environmental risks and growing marginalization and the excluded and the subaltern that Beck so eloquently identifies. In my own tradition, preaching is not often thought of as an act of public theology. It often mutates into multiple ways, and since Roman Catholics have more law than we know what to do with, we have legions of canonical directives about who can, who should, and what might people preach about. Most, after Vatican II, thought that Roman Catholics should, and it's largely a clerical enterprise, think about preaching as evangelization, catechesis, didascalia, and the homily. The last one is the only truly liturgical one. I think disproportionately influential in my own community and some others was a 1982 document, Fulfilled in Your Hearing, that defined the homily as a scriptural interpretation of human existence. It is devoid of what Tracy calls the analogical or the sacramental. It emphasizes only and essentially preaching scripture, which sounds oddly Protestant to these Roman Catholic ears. Even more zombie-esque is its centripetal focus on the spiritual development of only believers, possibly camouflaging an underlying subtext concerned primarily with promoting church membership, preaching as marketing. While an understandable strategy for maintaining institution in an age of solids, when defection from one faith community to another was only calculated in terms of erosion and diminishment, this preaching trajectory seems less useful or productive in this fluid era. I think the stepchild of public theology is a better framework. Martin Marty is the recognized progenitor of the term. He talks about public theology as an effort to interpret the life of a people in terms of the light of a transcendent referent. The goal of public theology is not helping people reflect on their personal relationships with God. It's also not corralling new believers, but it's concerned with influencing and shaping civic, social, and political life from a theological perspective. The writings of Marty have persuaded me to reconsider the nature of preaching, no longer as what I would caricature as an in-house strategy for engineering the salvation of adherents and the collateral fiscal and political support of its leadership, but rather preaching in the liquid age is conceived of a form of public theology, a kind of creedal enactment announcing essential beliefs and values, not only in full view of society, but even more so for society. At least three major objections to this reframed approach spring to mind. First, it seems to abandon what might be considered the religious community's spiritual base. Second, it suggests preaching to a ghosted assembly, to people who are largely absent. And thirdly, it seems to disable preachers from engaging their own traditions because they've been rejected by so many. So a few preemptive responses. The pivot to public theology, in my opinion, is not abandoning the base. Instead, it's prodding them into lived evangelization, what Pope Francis contends is the responsibility of every Christian. Francis voices his concern about Roman Catholic laity, especially those in ministry, because he says they do not reflect any penetration of Christian values into the societal, political, and economic sectors. They seem devoid of a commitment to applying the gospel to transforming society. From a missiological perspective, the church does not exist to serve itself, but to serve the world. If you read the Gospel of John says that God does not have a love affair with churches. God has a love affair with the world. Preaching, calibrated as public theology, serves that purpose. Second, while preaching to the disaffiliated seems like preaching to a phantom assembly, given the state of cafeteria religiosity, are not many of the assemblies already peppered with people of variegated interest and commitment? I think that equation, in my experience, tilts even more towards the so-called nuns on holy days become holidays: Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, Valentine's, and then all of those occasional services, weddings, funerals, baptisms, bar mitzvahs, attended by a whole panoply of believers and seekers and skeptics and critics. Isn't every funeral, especially of the young, an exercise in kaleidoscopic believing? Even the obsequies for an octogenarian grandmother convene in a unique and unrepeatable way not only the disaffiliated from her own offspring, but grandchildren with their Buddhist partners, their Sikh friends, and agnostic co-workers. And then what happens when your homilies are posted or podcasted or YouTubed or undergo other types of digital distribution? What happens when the word becomes algorithmic and dwells among us? I would suggest that preachers now are not called to abandon their tradition when preaching in public mode, but are called to exploit it, both utilizing as well as reconstructing what was handed on to them. Paul offers a model of this in his celebrated preaching at the Areopagus. He clearly did his homework. His speech indicated that he understood local philosophies, Greek and Roman gods. He sprinkles his speech with citations from familiar sources. He even employs conventional patterns of Greco-Roman rhetoric, but he doesn't water down the gospel. He contextualizes it in order to make it more palatable to his Athenian hearers. Rather than rhetorically circling the wagons, this disquisitional approach is resonant with Pope Francis and others called the New Areopagus, a fresh incarnation of the court of the Gentiles, special places of encounter where believers and non-believers engage in dialogue about fundamental issues and the search for the transcendence. And of course, Francis calls agnostics precious allies, because every statistic demonstrates that they still believe that religious institutions are their best allies in building peaceful coexistence, protecting creation, and defending human dignity. And how do you forge such centrifugal preaching that nurtures dialogue without abandoning one's base? Now, common wisdom suggests that an expert is anybody from over 50 miles away with a PowerPoint presentation and a return airline ticket. Guilty as charged. I can no longer instruct you how to perform such homiletic acts as I can instruct my Muslim or evangelical or Jewish students how to engage as practical theologians in Myanmar, Peru, Ghana, and their other countries of origin. But I can offer tested methods that must be deconstructed and reconstructed. In that spirit, I offer a singular theological reflection, subsequent preaching strategy, and a mode for implementing that, which you will have to deconstruct and reconstruct. For me, the beginning point is the cultivation of a positive theological anthropology. This could simply be personal preference. I'm a bit of a Runarian here, but it strikes me as difficult to extend an invitation to common ground if I intuit that the ground I inhabit or the path I offer is fundamentally graced, while that of my invitees is essentially misdirected or corrupt. Such a rift is too wide for the mutuality this endeavor requires. A positive theological anthropology is not one that ignores sin or error or corruption. Paul did not gloss over that in preaching at the Areopagus. But he did respect his hearers. He even calls them very religious. This presupposition about leading with a favorable view of humanity is not only strategically important, but I think theologically critical. As a Christian and a Roman Catholic, my reading of the Catholic Christian traditions affirms that transcendence assumed humanity And in doing so, divinity testified to the fundamentally graced nature of all humanity. 2 years ago during January, I had the privilege, I teach in the Philippines from time to time, and I was there when Pope Francis was there celebrating Mass with 6 million of his closest friends. He is a world-class baby kisser, all right? He's in a papal jeepney going around this group afterwards, and they're handing him baby after baby to kiss, and at no point does he say, validly baptized, parents validly married in the church. No, every child is an image that incarnation continues. Christians recognize what the Dalai Lama knows very well. Humanity is the only thing we have in common. It's the only thing we have. In his pushing for a global ethic, he says you cannot use religion because religion divides. At least a third of the global inhabitants have no religion. What we have is humanity. It's something that Pope Francis says as well. He says we have to have an ear to the people. We have to have an ear to the human situation. This is, from my perspective, preaching as an exercise in Christian humanism. That's not simply a capitulation to secularism or a return to 15th century Italy. It's a framework with increasing frequency. People are employing over and over again. David Clem, William Schweiker talk about theological humanism as critical because it goes beyond confessionalism and it allows dialogue with the sciences. Partially under his influence, my old friend Don Browning also argues that specifically Christian humanism is essential because its critical role in advancing public conversation. Within Roman Catholicism, no one less than Benedict XVI thought that Christian humanism was an appropriate stance to respond to the global economic crisis in 2009. Decades before, Paul VI talked about newly enhanced life through incarnation. He talked about transcendent humanism, the new humanism that guarantees authentic human development, full-bodied humanism that leads to the fulfillment of the whole person. And more recently, Pope Francis has been called for over and over again new and renewed humanism. For example, when he accepted the Charlemagne Prize a couple of years ago in Europe. The preaching strategy that arises from this is not one that commences with inside belief or in-house rules. They exact too high a toll, and they become the homiletic equivalent of a large sign announcing private property, intruders not allowed. Instead of declaring some Christological or Trinitarian or canonical imperative, it's sort of like filling the air with seeker repellent. My task is to engage the depth of people's humanity through concrete interface with current events across the living spectrum of the physically and digitally assembled. There are sufficient illustrations of racism, sexism, nativism, and violence bombarding the airwaves. Charlottesville, the DACA repeal, North Korea, terrorism, London, Afghanistan, Las Vegas. You don't need to be a Christian to have just anger rise in you, or to develop what's called narrative empathy and basic compassion. And on a more positive note, there's an abundance of beauty and goodness in art and action and literature and hospitality and sheer humanity. Think of what has been called the Armada of Volunteers, or the Dunkirk on the Bayou in Houston, when ordinary folk with ordinary boats and canoes and rescued thousands. Those who wish to extol humanity have a myriad of launching points. Leading with the human condition in all of its joy and griefs, especially in narrative mode, is the strategy that I adopt in this age of disaffiliation. Without a full-blown excursus, a few words about the narrative impact seem necessary. Anthropologists have well documented the importance of storytelling for the emergence of cultures, and social scientists have explained that storytelling is a fundamental and maybe even the aboriginal way that human beings construct and communicate themselves and their world. Recently, neuroscience, and they have a lot to teach us, have demonstrated, pushing it further, that by using magnetic resonance imaging, vivid storytelling can light up as many as 7 different parts of the brain, whereas information dispersal lights up 2. You read the Harvard Business, am I allowed to say that word here? Harvard Business Journal, and they're telling advertisers, tell a story. Professor Paul Zock of Claremont Graduate University has been at the forefront of some of this work. He's discovered a chemical in the brain called oxytocin, and it's a key signal to another that the situation or person is safe. It motivates cooperation. He says compelling human stories consistently prod the brain to produce this chemical. It affects engaging listeners, and it motivates empathy. We're wired for empathy if we tell a story. This neuroscience collaborates an insight from the philosopher Richard Kearney at Boston College, who argues that an empathetic imagination is a narrative imagination. The failure of the narrative imagination, according to Kearney, makes genocide possible. He says if we possess narrative sympathy, enabling us to see the world from another point of view, we cannot kill. He says if we do not have narrative empathy, we cannot love. Thus, I attempt to make storytelling a hallmark of my preaching. I do not do so only out of expediency, though I do think it's effective, but because of fundamental theological and ritual and liturgical reasons. And I close with one more. Using a flawed philological argument, it's common for folk to explain the nature of liturgy through the mistranslation of the Greek and Latin, laos and ergon, sometimes calling liturgy the work of the people. That suggests worship in Christian terms that is at least slightly heretical. Semi-Pelagian as an enterprise ignores the fact that Roman Catholic teaching is that liturgy is something that God does, that the Spirit initiates. If you look at the original usage in Greek, in ancient Greece, liturgia did not simply mean that work that people did, but it was a public work accomplished by the privileged and powerful men on behalf of ordinary folk, like sponsoring a festival, commissioning a play, underwriting a sporting event, leading a diplomatic delegation. Thus, liturgia is not best translated the work of the people, but work on behalf of or for the people. From an Areopagan perspective, the people for whom this work is done are not simply the baptized, but the whole people of God, Abrahamic believers, agnostics, Sikhs and seekers, Hindus and humanists, including those non-theistic precious allies of whom Pope Francis speaks. If Christianity exists not simply in service of its own mission, a surefire formula for becoming a zombie institution, but in service of God's mission, then it seems right and just, at least in my tradition, that preaching and ritualizing and praying and singing are in mission to the same world. Now, one of the things that I've not done much here is I've talked about, but I have not told stories because this is not a preaching event. This is talking about preaching. But in order to honor that important venue, I share one story. I actually used it in preaching 2 weeks ago after the Las Vegas massacre. And it comes from a YouTube video that you might have seen from November 2015, after the 130 people were killed at those various venues in Paris. And it was a reporter interviewing a 6-year-old, Brandon, standing in a Paris square in his father's embrace. There were people laying flowers and lighting candles to honor the victim, and the reporter asked the boy if he understood why terrorists attacked. His French was so good that I could understand it. He said in simple but crisp French, yes, because they are très, très, très méchants. They're very, very bad. Bad guys aren't very nice, and we really have to be careful, he says, because we have to change home. Il me faut changer maison. The father says, no, don't worry, we don't have to change homes. C'est la France maison. France is our home. But Daddy, there are bad guys, he says. There are bad guys everywhere, Dad counters. They have guns, pistol. They can shoot us. Well, they have guns, but we have flowers, the father says. Nous avons des fleurs. The boy turned around to look at some of the flowers behind him. There was this mass of flowers and candles. Flowers don't do anything, the boy argues. See all the flowers, the father asks? They're to fight against the guns. Are they there to protect us, the boy asks. Pour protéger. And the father said, mais oui. And the preschooler asks, les bougies? The candles too? Yes, his father said. It's not to forget those who left us yesterday. The flowers and the candles are there to protect us. And the journalist asks Brandon, do you feel better? And the 6-year-old responds, oui, ça va mieux. Candles and flowers make a 6-year-old feel better. I would argue that the baptized in my own community recognize they have to be the candles. They have to be the flowers. At baptism, they were given a Christ light. We have to be the candles and flowers, the blooming of civility, light in the darkness, against hatred, gun violence, prodding too often complacent leaders to take a stand in the light in the face of darkness, so that we might achieve the lyrical peace that Paul sang about in his hymn to the Philippians. The word challenges us. The text that day was from Matthew about absentee landlords. And it seems to me that we cannot be absentee landlords of society. But this is rather a spiritual call to arms, to civic responsibility, to ecclesial action, to community engagement, so that light might shine and civility might bloom forever and ever. And I would say to my community, and the church says, amen.